They gave Bumpy Johnson 24 hours to disappear. No trial. No negotiation. Just a quiet message delivered at sunrise: leave Harlem or be removed. The men who issued that warning controlled the courts, the politicians, and the muscle. They expected fear. They expected chaos. What they got was silence. By noon, Bumpy hadn't fled. He hadn't called for backup. He hadn't made threats or moved money. He simply walked out onto Lenox Avenue, dressed sharp, moving slow, saying almost nothing. And that's when the clock stopped mattering. Because in Harlem, power isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's the man who stays calm when everyone else is waiting for an explosion. This wasn't the first time someone tried to remove Bumpy Johnson from Harlem. By the late 1940s, he'd survived ambushes, prison sentences, betrayals from his own people, and pressure from law enforcement that would have buried most men twice over. But this ultimatum was different. It didn't come from a rival gangster or a hothead trying to make a name. It came from above, people with real political power, who'd grown tired of negotiating with a black man who refused to bow. They wanted Harlem cleaned up, reorganized, and controlled by someone they could manage. Bumpy wasn't manageable. He'd built something unusual in the underworld: loyalty that wasn't bought with fear. The numbers runners, the shopkeepers, the hustlers on the corner, they didn't follow Bumpy because he was violent. They followed him because he understood something most powerful men never do. Respect isn't demanded. It's earned in small, quiet moments. And for over 2 decades, Bumpy had been earning it. The message came early, hand-delivered by a nervous middleman who wouldn't make eye contact. No dramatic speech. Just a folded piece of paper with a time written on it. 24 hours. The man who delivered it left quickly, like he didn't want to be remembered. Word spread fast. By mid-morning, the streets knew. Bumpy Johnson had been given a deadline. His enemies assumed he'd respond the way most men in his position would: gather his crew, make moves, prepare for war, or quietly pack and vanish before things got bloody. Instead, he did something no one expected. He went for a walk. Bumpy stepped out of his brownstone just after 10 a.m., dressed in a dark suit, hat tilted low, no weapon visible. His face showed nothing. No anger, no worry, no defiance. Just calm. He walked south on Lenox Avenue, past the barbershops and corner stores, moving at a pace that suggested he had nowhere urgent to be. People noticed immediately. A shopkeeper sweeping his stoop paused mid-stroke. A group of men playing checkers outside a pool hall stopped talking. A woman carrying groceries slowed her step and watched him pass. Bumpy didn't speak to any of them. He didn't need to. His presence said everything. "I'm still here." By the time he reached 125th Street, a quiet ripple was moving through Harlem. No phones, no messengers, just the kind of communication that happens when a community has been watching the same man for 20 years. They knew what the ultimatum meant. And they knew what his walk meant. He wasn't running. Bumpy stopped at a newsstand, bought a paper, exchanged a brief nod with the vendor. The man's hands were shaking slightly as he made change. Not from fear of Bumpy, but from the weight of what was happening. The clock was ticking. The city was waiting. And Bumpy Johnson was reading the sports section. By early afternoon, the tension had shifted. The people who issued the ultimatum expected updates, confirmation that Bumpy was packing, that his crew was scrambling, that the situation was being handled. Instead, the reports coming back were strange. He's just walking around. No movement. No calls. No crew assembled. He bought a sandwich and sat in the park for 20 minutes. It didn't make sense. A man facing forced removal doesn't take a casual stroll. He doesn't sit on a bench. He doesn't act like the deadline doesn't exist. But that's exactly what Bumpy was doing. And the longer it went on, the more unsettling it became. Because the men who'd issued the ultimatum had made a critical miscalculation. They thought they were dealing with a gangster who ruled through violence and intimidation. They thought removing him would be simple. Issue the order, apply pressure, watch him fold or fight. They didn't understand what Bumpy actually was. He wasn't just a boss. He was a presence. He was woven into the fabric of Harlem in a way that couldn't be extracted with a 24-hour notice. By mid-afternoon, something else started happening. The support systems the authorities had relied on, informants, cooperative business owners, local enforcers who'd agreed to help with the transition, began to go quiet. Calls weren't returned. Meetings were postponed. People who'd promised cooperation suddenly had complications. No one was openly defying the order. But no one was helping enforce it either. And the clock kept ticking. At 5 p.m., Bumpy was seen entering a small cafe on 7th Avenue. He sat alone at a corner table, ordered coffee, and watched the street through the window. By now, the entire neighborhood knew what was happening. People walked past the cafe slowly, glancing inside. Some nodded. Others just looked. No one spoke about it directly, but the message was clear. We see you. We're with you. The men who'd issued the ultimatum were starting to realize something deeply uncomfortable. They'd set a deadline they couldn't enforce. Not because Bumpy had assembled an army. Not because he'd made threats or called in favors. But because the thing they were trying to remove wasn't just a man. It was trust. It was years of quiet decisions that had built something more powerful than fear. You can threaten a gangster. But you can't threaten a legend the people have chosen. As the sun dropped behind the Harlem skyline, the 24-hour deadline was entering its final stretch. Bumpy Johnson had less than 7 hours left. The city should have been bracing for violence, or watching a man pack his life into a car and disappear into the night. Instead, Harlem felt strangely calm. Bumpy left the cafe just after 6 p.m. He walked east, hands in his pockets, still moving with that same unbothered rhythm. He stopped briefly outside a church where a small evening service was ending. He tipped his hat to an elderly woman coming down the steps. She smiled, touched his arm, said something quiet. He nodded and kept walking. By now, the authorities were no longer confident. The plan had been simple: issue the ultimatum, let the pressure build, and either Bumpy would leave or they'd have justification to remove him by force. But neither was happening. And worse, no one seemed willing to be the person who made the final move. What the men in power didn't fully understand was how deeply Bumpy had embedded himself into the daily life of Harlem. It wasn't about control. It was about connection. He knew the name of every numbers runner. He'd helped families pay rent when times got hard. He'd settled disputes without bloodshed. He'd protected people who had no other protection. And over 20 years, those small, quiet actions had built something no deadline could erase. That evening, the network activated, not through orders, but through instinct. A police officer who'd been assigned to monitor Bumpy's movements suddenly called in sick. A city official who'd agreed to sign off on the removal paperwork couldn't be reached. A crew of enforcers hired to escort Bumpy out of Harlem if necessary sat in a bar 3 blocks away, waiting for a call that never came. No one was openly defying the order. But no one was executing it either. The deadline was approaching, and the machinery meant to enforce it had quietly stopped working. At 8 p.m., Bumpy made his final stop of the day. He walked into a pool hall on 135th Street, a place he'd owned for years but rarely visited. Inside, the usual crowd was there: card players, hustlers, men nursing drinks and passing time. When Bumpy walked in, the room didn't freeze. No one jumped to attention. But the energy shifted. Conversations continued, but quieter. People stayed aware. He walked to the bar, ordered a drink, and stood there, not addressing anyone, not making a speech. Just present. A younger man approached him, mid-20s, sharp-dressed, ambitious. He'd been making moves lately, trying to build his own name. "They really gave you 24 hours?" the young man asked, voice low. Bumpy glanced at him, took a sip of his drink. "That's what they said." "And you're just here?" Bumpy set the glass down slowly. "Where else would I be?" The young man didn't have an answer for that. Bumpy turned slightly, looking out at the room, at the men playing cards, the ones laughing at the corner table, the bartender wiping down glasses. "You think power is about who's got the biggest crew?" Bumpy said quietly. "Who can make the most noise?" The young man stayed silent. "Power," Bumpy continued, "is being able to stand still while everyone else is running. It's knowing when not to move." He finished his drink, placed a bill on the bar, and walked toward the door. Before leaving, he paused and looked back at the young man. They gave me a deadline because they thought time was on their side. But time doesn't mean anything if the people don't move with it. And then he was gone. By 10 p.m., the men who'd issued the ultimatum were in a quiet panic. The deadline was 2 hours away, and nothing had happened. Bumpy hadn't left. No arrest had been made. No confrontation had occurred. Worse, the optics were becoming a problem. If they forced the issue now, sent police, caused a scene, dragged him out, it would look like exactly what it was: powerful people overreacting to a man who'd done nothing but exist. And Harlem would remember. One official suggested letting the deadline pass quietly. Let it go. He'll slip up eventually. But that wasn't an option either. They'd made the threat public. If they didn't follow through, it would look like weakness. Like Bumpy Johnson had called their bluff and won. So they waited. And the clock kept ticking. At 11:30 p.m., Bumpy returned to his brownstone. The street was quiet. A few people lingered on stoops, watching without watching. No one approached. No one needed to. Bumpy climbed the steps to his front door, unlocked it, and stepped inside. He didn't lock the door behind him. Didn't pull the shades. Didn't barricade himself in. He simply walked to his living room, sat in his chair, and waited. Outside, the city held its breath. The authorities had patrol cars positioned nearby, just in case. Officers sat in unmarked vehicles, waiting for orders that never came clearly. Midnight arrived. The 24-hour deadline passed. No knock came on Bumpy's door. No sirens. No forced removal. Just silence. By 12:30 a.m., it was over. The ultimatum had expired, and Bumpy Johnson was still in Harlem, sitting in his home, unbothered, untouched. The men who'd issued the deadline had two choices: escalate into a confrontation that would make them look desperate, or quietly let it go and pretend it never happened. They chose the latter. No official statement was made. No follow-up action taken. The whole thing faded into rumor and whisper, the way uncomfortable failures always do. But in Harlem, the message was clear. They tried to remove Bumpy Johnson with a deadline. And the clock had meant nothing. Because you can't evict a man the people have chosen to keep. The morning after the deadline, Harlem woke up the same as it always did. Shopkeepers opened their doors. Street vendors set up their carts. The rhythms of daily life continued, uninterrupted. But something had shifted. Bumpy Johnson walked out of his brownstone just after 9 a.m., dressed sharp as always, moving with that same calm precision. He didn't make a speech. Didn't hold a press conference or send a message to his enemies. He simply existed, and that was enough. People saw him on the street and nodded. Some smiled. Others just watched, a quiet respect in their eyes. The 24-hour ultimatum had come and gone, and Bumpy was still there. Not because he'd fought. Not because he'd threatened or negotiated. But because the people of Harlem had decided he belonged. And when a community makes that decision, no deadline in the world can overrule it. What Bumpy understood, what his enemies never grasped, was that real power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. The men who issued the ultimatum had relied on the tools they knew: authority, intimidation, official orders. They believed that power came from the ability to enforce consequences. But Bumpy had built something different. He'd spent decades making small, unglamorous decisions that earned trust. He'd been present when people needed him. He'd stayed calm when others panicked. He'd chosen patience over aggression, strategy over spectacle. And over time, those choices had woven him into the fabric of Harlem in a way that couldn't be undone with a piece of paper and a deadline. His power wasn't in what he could take. It was in what people were willing to give him. Their loyalty, their silence, their choice to stand with him when it mattered. That kind of power doesn't fade when the clock runs out. In the days that followed, the story spread. Not through newspapers or official channels. They stayed quiet, embarrassed by the failure. But in barbershops, on street corners, in pool halls and late-night conversations, people talked about what had happened. How Bumpy had been given 24 hours to leave. How he'd spent the day walking through Harlem like nothing was wrong. How the deadline had passed and no one had come for him. And how the most powerful move he'd made was simply staying still. The story became a lesson, passed from the old heads to the young hustlers trying to make their way up. You don't need to be the loudest in the room. You don't need to make threats to be feared. You just need to be the one people trust when everything falls apart. Bumpy didn't celebrate the victory. He didn't gloat or make moves to punish those who tried to remove him. He just went back to work. He met with his numbers runners. He checked in on the businesses under his influence. He walked the streets, listened more than he spoke, and kept the machinery of his world turning smoothly. To an outsider, it would have looked like nothing had happened. But everyone in Harlem knew. The man who'd been given a deadline to disappear had instead become more present than ever, not through force, but through sheer, unshakable presence. And the people who'd tried to remove him? They learned a hard truth. You can issue all the orders you want. But if the community doesn't move with you, those orders are just noise. The officials who'd issued the ultimatum never tried again. Not because they'd given up on controlling Harlem, but because they realized they'd miscalculated what kind of man they were dealing with. Bumpy Johnson wasn't a thug you could scare away. He wasn't a politician you could buy off. He wasn't a loudmouth you could embarrass into submission. He was something rarer, a man who understood that true power is quiet, patient, and earned over time. And once you have that kind of power, deadlines don't matter. Calendars don't matter. Threats don't matter. Because the only clock that counts is the one the people set, and they'd already decided Bumpy's time in Harlem wasn't up. Years later, people still talked about the 24-hour ultimatum. Not because of what Bumpy did, but because of what he didn't do. He didn't panic. He didn't lash out. He didn't run. He just stayed. And in doing so, he proved something that every real leader understands. Presence beats pressure. Patience beats panic. And loyalty, real loyalty, earned through years of small, consistent actions, beats authority every single time. They gave Bumpy Johnson 24 hours to leave Harlem. The clock ran out. And he never moved an inch. Because when a man is woven into the soul of a place, you can't remove him with a deadline. You'd have to remove the place itself. And Harlem wasn't going anywhere. Neither was Bumpy. So here's the question. What's more powerful, a loud threat, or a quiet man who refuses to move? If you respect the kind of intelligence that doesn't need to shout, hit that like button. Drop a comment with your thoughts on what real power looks like. And if you want more stories about the people who moved in silence and still shook the world, subscribe. Because this channel is built for people who understand. The most dangerous move is the one no one sees coming. And Bumpy Johnson never needed anyone to see it. He just needed them to feel it.